tell me first of all, what's a conservation architect?
Aha. Good question. And when I entered architecture, I had no idea about such a thing. But I was interested in history at school, and I went through my architectural education, which was a very general education, and thought I was going to be a designer. And then it gradually dawned on me that some people in my profession were not wholly designers, but also were the custodians of buildings. So my answer to your question is that I think I am the custodian of older properties, buildings which exist, rather than buildings which are going to be created.
That's really, really interesting to see that sort of side which I hadn't thought of. So how, first of all, possibly, how did you come to be doing your role at Silverburn?
Okay, it's a long story, which goes back to about 2012, when I was made aware of Silverburn Park by someone called Bob Watt, who's now deceased, unfortunately. He was the partner of Sinclair Watt Architects. He was working, as I was, with Fife Historic Buildings Trust on properties in Fife. I was working for them on more historic projects, and Bob was more of a sort of mainstream architect. And I think there was a discussion between him and the then director of FHBT, Alan Lodge, about wouldn't it be a good idea if you, Bob, spoke to Steve about how you could jointly carry forward a project. I was pleased to be asked. He took me to lunch in Aberdour, where I live, and we had a lovely lunch and we talked about the whole project, during the course of which I agreed or committed to helping him should the project ever come to fruition. Unfortunately, within a very short space of time, Bob died, and I heard nothing more about it until 2016, I think, when Ian Mitchell, for whom I now work as the architect, approached me, along with Lorraine Bell from Fife Historic Buildings Trust, to ask me to come along to an initial meeting and to see the building. I was aware of the building, but I'd never actually been to the site. My children had been when they were children, as part of the school activities. So I'd heard about it, but I'd never been. So that 2016 was the first time I came here. We didn't get inside the building, or at least not very much. I remember being given a whole lot of instructions about health and safety and what not to do. We sort of talked through the project, and I think at that time feet were being brought into the frame by Fife Council. A lot of things happened in the background for which I wasn't involved. And then the next thing was that in 2017 we actually got access and recorded the building as best we could, taking photographs, doing some measurements and so on. But at that time the building was full, absolutely full of artefacts which had been part of the museum side of the building in its last use.
Did you have any involvement with Silverburn House?
Yes, indeed. So as part, I think when I come involved in a project, I do want to look at the bigger picture. It's not just about the building, but about the setting and the overall, the social history side of a project. So it became quite apparent to me, even before we had done the archive research, that there was a special, Silverburn was special in that it was both a residential site and a factory, effectively, on the same site. Silverburn House stood. It was all boarded up, and part of the project we were paid to do a condition survey on both it and on Corrimar, the other smaller house. I think I might have been one of the last people to have been inside Silverburn House on official business. There were signs at the time that there had been people getting in and using fireplaces to set light and keep themselves warm, I think. And the building it had roller shutters on all of the windows, which we had to unlock to get in. And it was a bit spooky because there was no daylight. But I was able to get round and take a huge number of photographs, which are still available. And then one night it burnt down. And then very quickly thereafter, the council decided that they should demolish the building, which was regrettable, really, because I think, and as the master plan and the conservation management plan say, the presence of a building of the nature of Silverburn House is key to the setting in which the flax mill stands. So it's a long held wish that some other building might appear there in the future of some merit, which would, because there is a particular place in the site where the house belongs, and I feel that that should be filled in some form or other in the future.
Did you get into Corrimar as well?
I only got into the doorway of Corrimar and quickly realised that going any further was not going to be safe. So our reporting on Corrimar was done on the external appearance. The fact that we could see trees growing in the middle of the building led us to believe that the building could not be entered safely. And I think since then, although I haven't revisited, I think it's got worse. And, well, I fear for its future.
Why is Silverburn Flax Mill a building of significance? In terms of
in conservation parlance, there are ways of assessing significance, cultural significance, and through research and through things we see and find upon such a building, you're able to make some assessment of the levels of significance that exist and in which spheres. So for me, and I wrote the conservation statement, I assess Silverburn as being of national importance culturally and socially because of its connections with the flax retting and manufacturing process. The building itself isn't of such high significance, but it is still of moderate value. If there are measures that one can look at to compare, and its architecture is interesting. I'm rather curious about its origins. It doesn't seem to me to be a particularly Scottish building, but I'm not an architectural historian, so I'm just looking at it with my eyes. I see things about it which could even be English in the way that it's built. It was a very flexible building. It was built very cheaply, using local materials by and large, bricks from the Scooney brickworks and so on. It's clearly built in quite a hurry, but there's a degree of finesse about it, which many such properties don't have. So, yeah.
So, when you entered the building for the first time, how did that feel going around the building?
Well, I suppose one gets used to going into sort of dark spaces and damp spaces and, buildings which have curiosity in them. It was confusing at first because we couldn't get into all of the spaces, and many of the spaces were absolutely packed full of what I would call junk, but other people might call interesting artefacts. It was a delight to see how much of the building survived, because from its retting mill days, very little had actually changed. So it had sat for over 100 years in quite original condition.
Can you describe what you think the retting section would have been like? Because, as you say, you can see more evidence there of it. What do you think? What would the picture be of the retting room?
Well, I'm pretty convinced that originally the retting tanks, which in the position they are, were actually outside. I don't think that large space, which we now call the retting hall, was a building. I think that when they started the process, they weren't using the hot water retting system, and so they just followed the traditional pattern of digging a pit. It was a more sophisticated pit than many, but it seems to me to have been that the tanks were outside and they took the material to them in the normal way.
Is that on Fred's drawing then? Will that be on Fred's drawing where that actually happened, or is that's
Fred's drawing, he labels the spaces,
yes.
So it's the same labelled space
Yes.
as is now the building, but I actually think they built the building after the tanks were in place. That's my theory. I have a feeling that the Schenk hot water system was introduced after the retting process began, after the 1856-ish start date. I mean, it was a really good thing to have Fred Hammond as the industrial archaeologist, and he's been immensely useful to me, and I think to the project. But there are areas where we're still waiting for fact to arrive.
Can you tell me then, when in your role as a conservation architect on this project, what sort of challenges have you met along the way? Sure, very many.
When I worked and I had my own business, it was very much me, and so I didn't have to convince other people of things. I could simply do what I thought was right. And I'm not saying that I was always right, but yes, you didn't have to convince other people along the way. Working within a larger team, some of whom I did not select, they were foisted upon me, as it were. So I think there's this kind of education process that you have to go through, and every time a new person comes on board within the team or even on the contractual side, you have to then again set out the stall as to what's important here. And I think commercial pressures mean that sometimes the need to take care of the building comes lower than some of the other aspects. And that goes right back to the client, where I kept saying to Brian Robertson, as it was at the time, you're doing too much to this building, you're asking it to do too many things. But I was eventually he convinced me that this was necessary to safeguard the building and generate an income which would allow it. And that's obviously the principal thing about this whole project, is to allow an item which has been redundant for so long to be brought back into use and to pay its own way. And that's, I think, it is recognisable that is a necessary part of it. But sometimes the conservation issues then have to take a secondary level, and it's a constant battle. And even now, as we're working with the contractor, every day they're trying to push ahead, and I'm trying to get them to do it in such a way that things don't get broken or lost. And some of them have been great, with the guys that are digging the holes, pulling out the found items, the bottles, the clay pots and so on. I think that, it does show that they are interested, and you just have to educate people.
If the building was lost, what would be lost? I'm thinking here in terms of, what would be lost? I'm asking you.
Well, as we sit now, after Silverburn House has been lost, the flax mill is the centre or the focus of the site. without that, and without any other built forms existing in the space, I suspect it would not. I could not see a future for Silverburn estate, as it's termed, continuing. It doesn't, because there would. Yes, it would be nice for people to come and do the leisure activities which they do, but without a building, I suspect that would diminish over time.
How do you think it links to heritage and culture and memory? How does a building relate to these things in terms of the fact you're building it, you are there's regeneration, there's conservation going on in order to make it a functioning unit. How does that affect memory, and how does actually not having that at all affect people's memories of the place and so on, do you think? It's a very woolly question, but...
I think, obviously, the population changes as people are born, live and die, so people who have had prior engagement or involvement here will have a certain memory, but the younger generation won't have that memory, and possibly the story would not be told if there was not a way of giving that information, such as this project. I mean, one very large part of it is about interpreting the site and conveying the message and updating and so on. The longer a building is not there, the more diminished that memory will become. And so I think people are really excited about getting back into the new or reimagined building. I'm sure they're all very curious to know what's going on behind the Harris fencing and so on. And I think, I can see an excitement building, and hopefully they won't be disappointed.
Can you think of any examples where the building was lost and what the consequences of that might have been?
I've not been involved in a project where an entire building has been lost. I have written reports on structures which are which condemn the buildings, and they have eventually disappeared, and I think that was because they were unsustainable, and many of them were very flimsy, lightweight, and not of any historic value. One project which comes to mind, which does still grate with me, and I feel it's unfinished business, is that in a town not very far from here, I was asked to report on the condition of a steeple, a tall stone structure sitting above a civic building, not a church. And in conjunction with the owner and manager of the building, it was decided to take down the spire, carefully store all the stone and everything, record it in great detail with a view to it being rebuilt. However, that rebuild has not yet happened. And that leaves a huge gap in a high street of a small town in Fife, which I regret, and I am still pushing for people to get behind a campaign to have it rebuilt. I don't know whether that answers your question, but...
Partly. What's missing out of that townscape which that steeple represents?
Well, steeples are landmarks, and as such they fall, and it sits on the corner of two streets meeting, and so it does mark a special place in the urban form. But also the building spire contained a bell, and that bell was rung every hour, in fact every quarter of an hour, day and night, until the local residents asked for it to be turned off at night. But yes, the bell which was sounded and the clock to which it were attached are now missing, and I think that's something that civic spaces need. So I'm continually asking why certain things are done on this site, and it's things I see happening I understand why feet need to keep money coming in and so on. But there are things about, I think there's a quality about the landscape which can easily be lost. And we've just had a recent, very intense storm, and we've lost, a number of very large trees. And so one can't always rely on things which were there in the past. And in a way, it's the same as with buildings, that trees and vegetation and landscape can also change, and we're experiencing, climate change is happening, and that impacts on everything. So I'm keen that, as well as the building that we're working on, that the project realises the significance of things, just very simple things like, where do you put a litter bin, and how do you introduce garden furniture into a landscape, and who's maintaining, and what level of maintenance are going on with all of these things. So that's one aspect, and avoiding clutter, so that a caravan doesn't suddenly appear where it shouldn't, because they're not things which one would want to see in that context. And I think that the landscape and its links to the coast and the links are an important thing which mustn't be forgotten. So if we're planting trees, we should plant them in such a way that we don't obscure views and so on.
So tell me, do you enjoy your job?
Absolutely. I wouldn't do it. Well, I didn't start out in this profession knowing what an architect actually did. I arrived in my education system having got certain A-levels and higher and so on. So I kind of ended up where I am. And even when I'd gone through college, I still didn't know what an architect really did. And that's possibly a failing of the education system that I was in. But working with so many different people, and that's, I get the biggest buzz out of meeting people and dealing with. It's the people, actually. The buildings are important, but they're not the key element in why I enjoy what I do. But I do really enjoy it.